Hi, hello, and welcome to this Devex UNGA 76 event. My name is Stephanie Beasley. I'm the senior reporter on global philanthropy at Devex, and I will be your moderator for this discussion on the impact the pandemic and other issues have had on the philanthropy sector this year. Joining me are Dedo Baranshamaje, Director of Strategy in Africa for the Segal Family Foundation, Phil Buchanan, President of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and Heather Grady, Vice President of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate your participation. So our time is short, and I'm going to dive right in. COVID has changed so much about our work lives, our home lives, our economies, our healthcare systems, our communities, and how many of us view the world. I want to start by asking each of you, how has and how should the pandemic change philanthropy? And I'll start with you, Phil.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here, Stephanie, and great to be with Heather and Dedo. And I will speak in particular to what I know best, which is sort of institutional philanthropy in the US, by which I mean foundations. And what I think we saw change was a lot of default behaviors on the part of foundations that got rethought in this time of incredible need and crisis. Specifically, we saw much more in the way of unrestricted funding, because if ever it was a moment where it's evident that nonprofits needed flexibility, this was it. We saw a loosening of restrictions because funders realized we don't want nonprofits on the front lines of a crisis spending their time filling out, a lot of reports for us. We saw spending levels rather than just being default to 5%, being rethought, and foundations stepping up spending, which actually, helped nonprofits fare better through this than many of them thought they would. We saw more focus on listening to people in communities, people closest to the issues. And lastly, I think we saw more attention to issues of systemic inequity, including racism, and how they intersect with whatever it is philanthropy is trying to do. The question now is, was that a blip, or will it be sustained?
Heather, what do you think? I mean, where are you seeing changes, and what are your thoughts about whether or not these are things that will continue past the pandemic, or if this is something that's happening in this moment and maybe won't continue?
Thank you, and good to see everyone. Very honored to be on the panel with my fellow panelists. And I'm coming to you from San Francisco International Airport, hence the mask part of the time. I would say I want to add to the pandemic the other crises we've had in the last couple of years around climate and environment, and also what we've been seeing around the racial justice struggle in the United States and elsewhere. And I would really agree with everything that Phil said. And I think in addition, we've realized how hard it is to really reach deeply into communities and get funding and resources and greater capacities there, our inability to reach them well enough. And that overlays with the inequity point that Phil made. So I think we may have, what we really want to see is, has this changed forever the way that philanthropy works? So the default changing from more restriction, shorter term grants to giving to more systemic issues. And we really hope it has changed it for the long term.
Okay. And Dedo, I wanted to ask you the same question. And if you had any thoughts about some of what you're hearing, I think it is really interesting, the mention of unrestricted grants. And I know that that's something, at least what I've read, is more common. Restricted grants for places in the global South, nonprofits in the global South. And I know you work with a lot of those folks. So yeah, I'm sort of curious about what you're seeing as changes, and if you have any thoughts about, unrestricted or restricted grants.
I totally agree with Phil and Heather. There's significant change in philanthropy around this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. There's so many things that have changed over the last 2 years. We're seeing more of community level and led giving, where communities are really harnessing the power of technology to think about ways to continue to extend humanity. And this is incredibly attractive for young people who are a little bit disillusioned, but also thinking about what are the other ways to respond than always channeling money through larger institutions who oftentimes sometimes take a little bit more time. But we are also seeing, on the other hand, how not much has changed. In the mainstream institutions, such as the bilaterals and larger foundations, I think there is a bit of window dressing around this idea of diversity and new local actors portfolio. But so many funders are still having to work a lot to really shift the power because they have concentrated the power with the wrong people, and the processes haven't changed very much. I really like that we are aware of this now, but that over time, people will change their processes and systems to really be more inclusive in who they target. Yes, and unrestricted funding is a way to go. This is something that our foundation has been really championing for the last 10 years. Thank God now people are realizing that for nonprofits to continue to work and very well, they need unrestricted funding, they need multi-year funding, and they need to be connected to other funders and to other organizations doing incredible work, and mostly centering all this work to proximate leaders. Of all the things that we have heard throughout this week, I don't think we insist enough on why and how we can center our approach around proximate leaders who are close to the problems that they're trying to solve around this platform.
Right. And so, I think this is really interesting, the points that you all are making, and particularly when you talk about like how some of these foundations are able or maybe unable to make these changes quickly. And I'm wondering if you all can talk, and I'll go back to you, Phil, just talk a little bit about how maybe, foundations, philanthropies, and even individual donors can kind of seize on what's happening in this moment and take that and make long-term changes to how they, their leadership is structured, how their governance works, and make sure that there are ways for, these grants to continue to, specific issues like, racial justice, social justice. I'll leave it then.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question and sort of the question. And I think, I would agree with Dedo that what we see is that there's a lot of change, but are folks really sharing power in significant ways, as he asks? Don't see necessarily evidence of that. Are the boards of foundations and who's on those boards changing meaningfully such that there is more, as he would put it, sort of proximate expertise and knowledge on those boards? I can't say that we've seen that. But in these other areas that I mentioned, I think there is evidence of some positive change that will last. And I think it's rooted in just the fact that we all saw nonprofits step up, in such dramatic ways. And we saw some of the kind of default sort of business frameworky analogies of the last couple of decades kind of blow up amid the realization that, for example, sometimes for a nonprofit, smallness is an asset, because smallness is community connection and trust and community rootedness. So it's not always about scale. We saw the degree to which top-down sort of consultant-driven solutions don't work in a time when the knowledge is in community and closest to the issues. So I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic that we're now beginning a path. I mean, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and people say, like, why haven't some of these things changed? What's it going to take to get these things to change? Well, maybe the answer is a global pandemic and a massive, reckoning on inequity is what it's going to take. And I hope that we can build on this and push from the things that I'm describing to the even more fundamental shifts that Dedo is calling for.
And I'm curious, and I want to ask you all each about this, because as you're talking, I'm just thinking about, one of the huge stories over the past year during this pandemic has been about Mackenzie Scott, billionaire philanthropist Mackenzie Scott, and her giving. She's given more than $8 billion in unrestricted grants to organizations around the world, many of them small and who she considers to have been overlooked. And so, when we get back to this question of restricted and unrestricted grants and what you're able to do with that. I actually read, I think it was a piece posted by the Center for Effective Philanthropy recently saying that, one of the benefits of her style is that it can build upon some of the work that was already done within these foundations. So that if you have this combination of someone like a Mackenzie Scott with, some of the work that foundations have already done with restricted grants, then maybe you can have a sustainable ecosystem. So I'm kind of curious, and I'll start back with you, Dedo, to ask what you think, one, about, Mackenzie Scott's style of giving, what the impact could be, and maybe how this can work to maybe form this newer idea or new direction for philanthropy moving forward from the pandemic.
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'm going to try to be to approach this diplomatically. What Mackenzie Scott did is not a new model. It's very radical, it's pragmatic, it uses lots of common sense in how one organization can speed up the process of creating positive impact. And there has been tons of organizations that are doing that kind of work. But we have to really, really give it up to her for really pushing other billionaires to be bold, and especially in a moment like this. And to me, it's a remarkable how we have lowered the expectation for funders. We expect them to act like villains, because they often do. We have Anand Giridharadas, who's speaking at our Future Summit in October, and expect him to excoriate organizations such as Segal Family Foundation and our sector, rightfully so. But I think this is a future where philanthropy has to be held accountable on how we give and how we think change happens. And kudos to Mackenzie Scott for all the work that she's doing right now. It's the future.
Great. Heather, do you have any thoughts about Mackenzie Scott and her impact, and also just about, the conversation still about restricted and unrestricted grants?
Yes, thanks. About her giving in particular, I think the key thing there is trust. She did not require her own institutional, her institution or her framework to redo the work that so many other funders have done already. So it was really trust-based giving, and she relied on the due diligence others had done. Secondly, just going back to some of the points that Phil was making earlier, I think there have been 3 changes that we've seen, and I really hope they last. The first one is funders working much more collaboratively. I think we see many more funders joining together, because whether it's the pandemic or climate challenges or racial justice, none of these are problems that any one funder will solve. So we see many more funder collaboratives. Secondly, I think we're seeing that diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been on the radar screen and been important for many philanthropic entities for many years, suddenly it became really an imperative. So people are putting more resources into it. They're taking it more seriously. And as one of my colleagues says, we're moving from talking about safe spaces to brave spaces. So we're having conversations that are quite difficult, especially for white people, but we're having them, we're going farther than we did before. It's a much deeper conversation. It's about personal change, not institutional change only. And the third thing I would say is really interesting ways that foundations are bringing in new capital, because philanthropy is only a tiny bit of all the resources in the world. I was in a conversation this week with the Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation, both of which have floated bonds, social bonds, labeled social bonds on the corporate bond market. That was something that came in last year. And that's simply because foundations and philanthropic entities have been sitting on too many assets that are unused for social purpose. So thinking of new ways that we can really ramp up the impact of philanthropy. And just finally on that point, I want to really echo what Phil said. We used to think about scale in terms of scaling one particular organization. Now we're thinking about what does it mean to scale impact or deepen impact? And it's often by supporting networks or alliances or movements. It's not just about growing one organization. And I hope that change lasts.
Stephanie, can I jump in on the Mackenzie Scott piece?
Sure, go ahead.
First of all, you kindly mentioned a post on the CEP blog, and I just want to give credit where it's due. It was a guest blog from Ruth Levine, formerly of Hewlett Foundation, and now CEO of a firm that I think is called ID Insight. And I think her argument is really important, and you alluded to it, because we need to be careful not to herald anything as the new one model that everybody should follow. Ruth was arguing that, as you mentioned, that Mackenzie Scott's approach, depends on the work that others have done to support and vet some of the nonprofits that she then was able to give, transformative gifts to. And everything is contextual. And so when Heather was talking about the question, that I had mentioned too, about, when to scale kind of an approach versus when to scale an organization. It's not that one should always do one or the other. There's a need for nuanced thinking about, given what we're trying to do, what is the right approach? And the same goes for a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. It's not that it's never appropriate to give a restricted grant or that experts should never be relied upon. It's just that we've given too few unrestricted grants and experts have been overly relied upon. And so it's about just thinking about what makes sense given the context. But there's this tendency, maybe it's in society, but in philanthropy for sure, to say, okay, this is the new thing. Everything else was dumb. And it isn't quite that simple.
Great. And I just want to kind of continue on this. And I'm thinking more about the recovery from the pandemic and all of the things that will need to be done to help, particularly, lower income countries rebound who have been disproportionately affected by the changes in the economy, by lack of access to healthcare. As we talk about different approaches to philanthropy resulting from this, what are you all seeing as, possibilities for how maybe some of these, major philanthropies or even, smaller groups can step in to help their colleagues, their counterparts in, the global South and other places to recover from this? How are you seeing, us moving forward in philanthropy? And I'll go back to you, Dedo. We'll start with you.
I think that's a really good question, and that is very hard. I think about it often, and I think the first thing that they need to do is to do the work themselves, to think about how they diversify their boards, how they diversify their teams, because I live and work and from the global South. I'm across sub-Saharan Africa oftentimes. But what we're seeing with even these new tools and new ways of responding, they are perpetuating the historical injustices and biases that we have seen in the past, that we have to be really, really careful before philanthropies and foundations and whatnot start working to do that work of expanding the tables, to include people who historically have not been included, and to really shift a little bit more, to push the envelope around this idea of expertise. Proximity have not been seen as expertise for the longest time. Trust and relationship with the communities that people are serving are not oftentimes seen as expertise. And I think that those are some of the fundamentals that philanthropy and the sector have to start, including on how they operate, and really think about how to not be between resource and the communities who need it, as Heather was saying earlier. We have seen people do a tremendous work during the pandemic and around the Black Lives Matter movement to deploy capital pretty quickly. Those are some of the things that we hope could stay. But if people were to take one thing, unrestricted funding, multi-year funding, and mostly diversify who gets to decide, and not to design with our own lenses for people who have a different lived experience.
Right. And on that note, I want to bring up another, huge story that happened this year, which was the divorce of the Gates, Bill Gates and Melinda French Gates, and the impact that is expected to have on their foundation. They had 3 trustees. Warren Buffett, who was the third, has since departed. Sort of retiring, I guess, for lack of a better word. And now they're planning to bring on new trustees to that foundation. They're going to announce that early next year. But a lot of what people are pushing for, people in the nonprofit world, people who follow the Gates Foundation are pushing for, is diversity among these trustees. They want folks in there who represent, different regions of the world, parts of the global South. And of course, they have said, Mark Sussman, who is the CEO, has said that that is something that they're planning to do. But what kind of opportunities are you seeing at the Gates Foundation? Of course, is hugely influential in the world of philanthropy. What opportunities are you seeing there? What happens if maybe, they come up with a group of trustees that isn't diverse? What kind of signal does that send to the rest of the world? So I wonder, and Heather, if you're okay, we can start with you just talking about what you think the impact that the Gates Foundation could have depending on, how they move forward through this divorce and with the new trustees that they plan to bring on.
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, undoubtedly, the Gates Foundation has an outsized influence because of their size and their notoriety. So what they do is quite important. So first, I would say a larger board than 3 or 4 people tends to be better. But it's not just size, it really is about who is on the board. So diversity is quite important. And I think it goes back to what Dedo was saying about expertise. How do we define experts? Often in foundations, the people who are chosen for the board are business partners or close associates of the founders. And we have to remember that true expertise does lie closer to where the problem is occurring. So we'll be watching that carefully. But I think, there are 90,000 or so foundations in the US and over 100,000 in Europe. So it's good to look at a variety of foundations and try to see what is best practice that's happening. And I do think that the more we can have the decision-making that happens at the C-suite level and the board level be done in partnership with and with representation from people who are working at the community level or grantee leaders or local experts, I think that's quite important. So we'll be watching the Gates Foundation carefully. I'm sure everyone in the sector.
Phil or Dedo, do either of you have any additional thoughts about that?
I mean, I would pick up on the last thing Heather said, which is the importance of people in boardrooms who actually possess knowledge and expertise, not just related to the issue areas, not just related to the communities being funded. That's all vital, but also related to the work of nonprofits and philanthropy, which is not the same as business. And I think there's this sort of assumption that the expertise gained by being a successful business executive or investor somehow translates magically into being great at philanthropy, as if, being great at basketball would make Michael Jordan great at baseball, which it didn't exactly, right? These are different things. And so we need to keep that in mind. And it shouldn't be a revelation, because actually, like Andrew Carnegie a century ago, more said, I'm going to turn from accumulating wealth to the much more difficult task of distributing it wisely. And Warren Buffett, when explaining why he was making his gift to the Gates Foundation rather than starting a big foundation of his own, said, look, in business, you look for the easy things to do. In philanthropy, you're taking on the toughest challenges and it's a harder game. Why we can't have folks begin with more humility and recognize that it isn't the case that everybody who's been doing philanthropy and nonprofit work knows nothing. They actually know something. Bring them into those boardrooms earlier. I think philanthropy would be better off for it.
All right. I recognize we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to get to my final questions. And I wanted to turn back to you, Heather, briefly to talk about what I see as sort of like the parallel story with the pandemic, which is climate change. In the past year, we've seen an increase in climate events, floods, fires, hurricanes, earthquakes. Things are really happening around the world. And you're seeing, major donors jumping into this space as well. Jeff Bezos this week just announced that he's setting aside $1 billion of his $10 billion Earth Fund for conservation efforts. And I'm curious, how you see that going from here. And, whether or not, as we're having these conversations about how philanthropy can be useful in preparing for, the next global COVID-like global crisis, how we can also wrap climate change and environmental philanthropy into those conversations, because that is, potentially the next huge global crisis.
Thank you. Yes, climate change and environment is an area that that I specialize in and that RPA is very strong in. And I think it's amazing what we're seeing, how many more philanthropists and individual donors and foundations are now leaning into climate change and environment. And it's really important for the future of everyone, for future generations. The positive thing here is that much more capital is coming in, many more partners, and a lot of it, again, a real emphasis on collaboration. And I think that's great. I think the challenge is going to be twofold. One is making sure we have a people's perspective on those issues and the solutions. There's a lot of people funding in climate change who have the feeling there's a silver bullet. And there really isn't a silver bullet. There are many, many solutions that are very interconnected, just as the problems are interconnected. So when we talk about a just transition, making sure that we're not just taking away jobs in the fossil fuel industry, but finding alternative jobs for those same people. Talking about if we're building renewable energy sources in the global south or in the United States in places where people don't have land rights. And so we're taking away one thing from people who haven't had a strong voice before, and we're replacing it with sort of another way of extraction or even exploitation in some cases. So we have to be very careful about how that capital is deployed. I see a lot of positive movement this week at the UN meetings and the upcoming COP. There's going to be strong voices from indigenous peoples around the world and from different kinds of alliances. So I'm very hopeful, but we really have to pay attention to how we do our work. And I think nature-based solutions to climate that really support, for example, regenerative agriculture, those are great solutions that more and more funders are finding. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Heather. All right, so we're near the end. I think we have about 3 minutes left. So just very quickly, I just wanted to ask each of you to talk about what you took away as like the major story this year, or what you wish had gotten more coverage. If there was something huge happening, but you felt like it didn't really get the coverage that it deserved. And I'll start with you, Dedo, and then we can just go around.
What did not have coverage? Maybe that would be much more interesting. I think, democratic transitions in Burundi and Malawi and elsewhere, it's not sexy and newsworthy, but that's the point. Both of these countries have measure of stability and peace that allows for hope, and this is a dynamite in this moment, and that we think it deserves a little bit more attention. The second thing I would say is just community level giving. I think we can't talk about this enough, but that's the two I can come up with.
Okay. Phil, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I wish that we paid more attention to the incredible heroism of nonprofit frontline workers in food pantries, in organizations that support those who were impacted disproportionately by the pandemic. I just think the nonprofit sector, not just in the United States, which I know best, but also in places like India, which I was recently reading about, have stepped up in incredible ways to do what business and government couldn't or wouldn't in a time of incredible need. And I think we should celebrate and lift up those organizations and their workers.
Great, thanks. And Heather, you get the last word.
I think in terms of what I think needs more attention from philanthropy is the whole area of privacy and negative impacts of social media, and making sure we have a free and open public media. This is absolutely crucial to the functioning of democracies, and we're losing the battle there, and I think we need to pay more attention. I think on a more hopeful note, the exposure, because of the pandemic and other issues, the exposure of how inequities and inequality runs across every single theme you work on: health, education, climate change, whatever the transport, it's in everything. So I really think it's lifted up that question of inequity and inequality.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and insights. I feel like I could listen to you all forever. This is really fascinating. But yeah, I just want to thank you for taking the time out to talk to us about this. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. Hopefully, if you have additional questions and thoughts, you can reach out to our guest here. You can also reach out to me. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Stephanie, for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.